The gasp that tore from my throat was abruptly cut off as the weight of my son-in-law slammed into my chest. When David shoved me, it was not the passionate, violent outburst of a man in a sudden fit of rage, but the clinical, unbothered dismissal of someone sweeping a pile of junk out of his walking path. My right knee, still stiff and unyielding from the severe bout of bacterial pneumonia that had hospitalized me 3 weeks prior, gave out instantly. I hit the polished, heated slate tiles of his Greenwich kitchen with a sickening thud, the sharp impact rattling up my spine and exploding into a blinding flare of agony in my left shoulder as it cracked against the brushed steel leg of the kitchen island. David didn't even pause his movement. He stood over me, hovering in his bespoke navy quarter-zip and designer lounge pants, his voice dripping with condescension as he barked that I was an incompetent, frail old woman who couldn't be trusted to watch a pan of wild mushroom risotto without scorching the pan and ruining a $40 batch of ingredients. Through the open archway, leading into the sunlit living room, I caught a glimpse of my daughter, Megan. She was seated on the custom cream velvet sectional, her eyes glued to her iPad screen, her posture locked in a posture of desperate, practiced deftness. She was rehearsing the quiet choreography of neutrality that victims of quiet emotional abuse master over years. What neither of them knew, what David in his arrogance and Megan in her terrified paralysis could not possibly fathom, was that the heavy, cream-colored linen envelope resting inside the pocket of my canvas apron, a letter from an old wealth private bank in downtown Manhattan that I had opened only 2 hours earlier, had already shifted the reality of the room beneath us. It contained a document that would not merely alter my future, but dismantle theirs entirely. As I lay on that immaculate, sterile floor, looking up at the man who viewed me as a domestic nuisance and the daughter who had chosen survival over loyalty, a cold, silent calm spread through my chest. My name is Evelyn Reed. I am 69 years old, and the game they thought they were playing had just completely changed. For over 25 years, since my husband Richard died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage, I had lived a deliberate, quiet life in our historic farmhouse in Litchfield County, Connecticut. It was an existence built on self-reliance and modest routine. I maintained the stone walls Richard had repaired, managed the conservative index funds and modest life insurance payout he had left behind, and took fierce pride in never asking anyone for a dime. It was in that house that I had raised Megan, constantly trying to instill in her the values of intellectual independence and spine. I thought I had raised a woman who knew her worth. I was wrong. Everything began to unravel late last November when a bad cold turned into severe pneumonia. After 10 days in the ICU and 2 weeks of rehabilitation, my doctor made it clear that returning alone to a drafty home during a brutal New England winter was out of the question for at least 2 months. That was when Megan stepped in, her voice strained with anxious concern over the phone, urging me to come stay at their newly renovated estate in Greenwich. She framed it as an act of devotion, telling me how much they wanted to care for me, how David loved my traditional home cooking, and how good it would be for all of us to be under one roof. I had hesitated. Every instinct I possessed warned me that entering David's space was a mistake. David was a managing director at a private equity firm in Stamford, a man whose entire identity was built on hyper-curated aesthetics, status signaling, and absolute control. I was a retired public librarian who wore faded denim, drove an 8-year-old Subaru, and preferred antique oak to minimalist Italian marble. But the vulnerability of my illness and the emotional longing to be close to my only child overruled my caution. I packed 2 bags, locked up the farmhouse, and moved into their home. Their residence was a sprawling, ultra-modern farmhouse rebuild, all floor-to-ceiling glass, stark black metal frames, and pale gray oak. It looked less like a home and more like a staged spread for an architectural magazine. In this environment, nothing was permitted to be out of place, including me. At first, the arrangement was tolerable. David was civil, if distant, bringing me extra blankets and asking superficial questions about my recovery. Megan flitted around like a nervous hostess, constantly adjusting pillows and offering tea, her face fixed in a tight, performative smile. However, as my physical strength slowly returned, the atmosphere shifted. The transition was subtle at first. David would leave a lingering look on a coffee mug left on a side table. He would ask, with a polite yet sharp tone, if I might clean the counters since I was moving around the house anyway. Within weeks, the polite requests vanished, replaced by an unspoken expectation of domestic servitude. My physical therapy appointments were treated as inconveniences that disrupted their schedule, while my days became consumed by laundry, vacuuming the vast square footage, and preparing intricate dinners to suit David's strict dietary preferences. I had not been brought to Greenwich as a recovering mother. I had been hired as an uncompensated housekeeper. When I tried to speak to Megan privately one afternoon while David was at his office, she immediately shut down. I told her gently that I felt less like a guest and more like help, showing her my swollen knuckles from scrubbing their imported tile showers. Megan didn't look me in the eye. She stared down at her phone, her thumb flicking nervously across the glass, her face taking on the same evasive look she used to wear as a teenager when she was caught in a lie. She told me I was misinterpreting things, that David was just under immense pressure with a new fund rollout, and urged me not to make things difficult when it was only for a short time longer. That short time stretched into months. Whenever I brought up returning to Litchfield, Megan panicked, making excuses about weather or road conditions, while David offered cold, logical dismissals about how much practical sense it made for me to stay and keep the household running smoothly. Under his steady stream of microaggressions, Megan seemed to shrink daily. She had become an echo in her own home, constantly apologizing, laughing at his unfunny jokes, and walking on eggshells. She had constructed a psychological bunker of silence to protect herself, leaving me to bear the brunt of David's casual cruelty alone. Which brought us to that miserable late afternoon in the kitchen. I had spent 2 hours preparing dinner, stirring a pot of rice over low heat, when David strolled in from his home office, visibly agitated from a phone call. He looked into the copper pot, made a face of intense disgust, and declared that the dish was completely ruined, sludgy, and inedible. When I stood my ground and reminded him that I had been cooking long before he was born, his composure snapped entirely. The polished veneer of the successful financier vanished, revealing an ugly, unchecked rage. He grabbed my forearm, his fingers pinching deep into my bruised skin, and shoved me backward away from the stove. My weak leg caught the edge of a rug, and I went down hard. Lying on that floor, with a burning pain radiating down my arm, I looked up and saw Megan standing in the doorway. Our eyes locked for a fraction of a second. In her face, I saw a flash of profound shame, followed immediately by calculated retreat. She looked away, dropped her head, and said nothing as David continued to curse, blaming my clumsiness for the fall. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional betrayal was devastating. The daughter I had poured my life into, whose college tuition I had scraped together every cent to pay for, had watched her husband physically assault me and chosen silent complicity. Slowly, deliberately, using the edge of the lower cabinet for leverage, I pulled myself up. I did not cry out, nor did I look at David. I walked steadily out of the kitchen, past my silent daughter, and went into the main floor guest suite, locking the heavy solid wood door behind me. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, my body shaking with adrenaline, I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the letter I had retrieved from the mailbox earlier that afternoon. The envelope bore the embossed logo of Northern Trust, an institution I knew only by reputation. It was addressed to me personally. The attached letter, signed by a senior vice president named Marcus Thorne, explained that his firm managed a private asset structure established by my late husband, Richard, nearly 30 years ago. Through property tax records and a recent probate audit, they had finally traced my current residential address to deliver formal notification of the account's status. As I read through the dense financial terminology, an astonishing truth unfolded. Richard, who had worked as a mid-level actuary for a regional insurance firm, had spent decades quietly operating a personal investment portfolio focused on early-stage technology infrastructure and land acquisition trusts. He had placed these holdings inside a blind, irrevocable trust designed to mature decades after his death, explicitly structured to shield the assets from premature liquidation or family disputes. A smaller, sealed envelope was tucked inside the main folder, written in Richard's distinct, precise penmanship. The short note began with my name, his familiar handwriting bringing tears to my eyes for the first time all day. He wrote that if I was reading this document, it meant he was long gone, and that life had presented me with a scenario where I required absolute financial autonomy. He explained that he had never hidden this wealth out of deceit, but out of a desire to preserve the integrity of our simple life while ensuring that, should catastrophe strike, I would possess an unassailable shield. He urged me to use what he had built without guilt, to secure my peace, and to stand firm against whatever difficulties had brought me to this point. I turned back to the official Northern Trust summary sheet to look at the bottom line. The total valuation of the liquid portfolio was slightly over $11 million, but it was the final page, detailing the Trust's real estate holding company, Berkshire Heritage Properties, that made my breath catch in my throat. The holding company owned several residential assets in southern Connecticut, including the underlying mortgage title and property deed for the very address where I was currently sitting. David and Megan had bought the house through a specialized corporate lease-to-own structure, but the actual ownership of the property was held entirely by the entity Richard had created. I read the legal description 4 times to be completely certain. This multi-million-dollar house, this cold glass box where I had been demeaned and treated as unpaid help, was owned by the trust. They were not the absolute owners they claimed to be. They were long-term corporate tenants whose master lease was managed by the entity I now fully controlled. Sitting on the bed, the physical ache in my shoulder began to recede, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The embarrassment and helplessness I had felt on the kitchen floor evaporated entirely. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I was no longer a vulnerable old woman stranded in her daughter's house. I was the sole trustee of an $11 million estate, and I was about to restructure the lease. The following morning, I rose before dawn. My shoulder was dark with purple bruising, a painful souvenir that served only to sharpen my resolve. I dressed in my best wool trousers and a crisp iron blouse, applied a neat coat of lipstick, and walked quietly into the kitchen. David was sitting at the marble island, scowling at his laptop. He glanced up, gave a curt nod, but said nothing about the previous evening. I calmly made his espresso, placed it beside his computer, and set out a small plate of toast, playing the part of the meek relative perfectly. When Megan emerged, looking pale and exhausted with heavy dark circles under her eyes, she avoided eye contact entirely, her hands trembling as she poured herself water. When she finally whispered an inquiry about how I was feeling, my voice was entirely smooth as I assured her I was perfectly fine. I casually mentioned that I had several personal errands to attend to in town and would not be available to prepare dinner that evening. David snorted without looking up, demanding to know what errands a retired woman could possibly have. But before he could launch into a lecture, I picked up my coat and walked out the door. Instead of taking my old car, I had arranged for a private car service to pick me up at the end of the driveway. The sleek black sedan carried me smoothly down the highway into downtown Greenwich, stopping in front of the stone facade of the Northern Trust building. I was escorted up to a private conference room where Marcus Thorne was waiting. He was a distinguished, articulate man in his 60s who treated me with immense professional courtesy. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed the portfolio documentation, executed the trustee transfer paperwork, and established my primary accounts. By 11 o'clock that morning, I had full, direct control over the entire liquid capital and real estate entities. We then turned our attention to Berkshire Heritage Properties. Mr. Thorne confirmed that the Greenwich residence was indeed leased to David's LLC under a commercial residential contract that was currently up for its mandatory triennial adjustment. When I asked about the protocol for lease modifications and property management, he explained that an outside management agency handled the billing and enforcement, operating strictly according to the instruction of the primary trustee. I looked Mr. Thorne in the eye and instructed him to immediately transfer all executive decision-making authority for Berkshire Heritage Properties directly to me. Furthermore, I directed him to notify the property management firm that the monthly lease rate for the Greenwich property was to be increased by 250%, starting on the 1st of the coming month, bringing it to the absolute maximum allowed under top-tier commercial luxury standard. I also instructed him that all standard lease covenants, including strict occupancy limits, property maintenance inspections, and zero-tolerance policies for late payments, were to be enforced to the absolute letter of the law. By mid-afternoon, I checked into a luxury suite at the Delamar Greenwich Harbor Hotel. I hired a personal shopping assistant, purchased several tailored suits, high-end leather boots, and a warm cashmere coat, and spent 2 hours at an upscale salon having my silver hair cut into a sharp, modern bob. When I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, the weary, frail woman who had entered the city that morning was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked every bit as formidable as the world she was about to confront. The frantic phone calls from Megan began late the following evening. I let the phone ring 4 times before placing it on speaker while relaxing in an armchair overlooking the harbor. Her voice was laced with hysterical panic. She rattled off a chaotic story about a formal legal notice that had just been delivered to their door by a process server, detailing an astronomical rent hike and an upcoming structural compliance audit. She sobbed that David was losing his mind, screaming at lawyers in his office, claiming the management company was engaging in predatory practices meant to force them out. I listened quietly, sipping my tea, before responding in a calm, detached tone. I remarked that high-end real estate markets were famously volatile and suggested that perhaps they should look for a more modest home that better suited their actual financial reality. My coolness shocked her, causing her to stammer out that this was their home, that they were being ruined, and demanding to know why I sounded so completely unconcerned about their crisis. I let a heavy silence linger on the line for a long moment before answering. In a quiet, unyielding voice, I asked her if she remembered 2 nights ago when her husband had thrown me onto the tile floor of their kitchen, and if she remembered sitting on her sofa, pretending not to notice. I told her plainly that detachment was a discipline I had learned while lying on her kitchen floor. Before she could process the words or offer a desperate apology, I wished her a good evening and disconnected the call. Over the next 10 days, I maintained my distance, observing the breakdown from afar through reports from my legal team. The first of the month arrived, and as expected, David refused to pay the adjusted lease amount, attempting instead to file an emergency injunction through a local real estate attorney. My legal counsel, a brilliant and aggressive litigator named Sarah Vance, whom I had retained through Northern Trust, immediately blocked the filing and served his corporate entity with a 3-day notice to pay or face formal eviction proceedings. Late on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Megan, calling from a muted, whispered environment. She was sobbing uncontrollably, revealing that David's temper had flared out of control under the immense financial pressure and humiliation. He had smashed furniture, accused her of conspiring against him, and grabbed her roughly during an argument in their living room. She admitted, through choked sobs, that she was terrified of what he might do next. This was the pivotal moment. The toxic aggression that David had previously directed at me had now turned, as domestic abuse invariably does, fully onto the partner who had enabled him. I spoke to her with absolute sharp clarity. I told her that a car was already parked at the end of her street. I instructed her to pack a single small bag with her essential legal documents, leave her phone behind on the kitchen counter to prevent tracking, and walk out of the house immediately without confronting David. 20 minutes later, the door to my suite at the Delamar opened, and Megan walked in. She looked broken, trembling, wearing an oversized coat and clutching a small leather bag. The moment she saw me, she collapsed onto her knees, weeping with a deep, visceral pain that had been built up over years of quiet, emotional confinement. I pulled her up, wrapped my arms around her, and held her until her shivering stopped, assuring her that she was finally safe and that the nightmare was over. That night, in the quiet warmth of the hotel suite, I laid out the financial documents, the Northern Trust statements, and the title deeds across the table. I explained the truth of Richard's trust, the ownership of the Greenwich property, and how every step of the past 2 weeks had been orchestrated to strip David of his perceived leverage. Megan stared at the documents in stunned silence, a slow, profound understanding washing over her face as she realized the true extent of her husband's vulnerability and her mother's strength. The final confrontation occurred 1 week later. David had refused to vacate the Greenwich property following the expiration of the legal notice, barricading himself inside the house while his legal options evaporated. I arrived at the property accompanied by Sarah Vance, 2 local sheriff deputies executing a court-ordered writ of possession, and a commercial locksmith. When the locksmith drilled out the main entry lock and the heavy front door swung open, the interior of the pristine home was in a state of utter disarray. Empty liquor bottles were scattered across the designer coffee tables, papers were strewn over the floor, and David stood in the center of the foyer, looking disheveled and unwashed. He immediately began screaming at the deputies, asserting his rights and threatening lawsuits against everyone involved. Then his eyes fell on me, standing quietly behind the officers in a tailored charcoal suit, flanked by my legal team. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury as he spat out that I was a bitter, manipulative old woman who had ruined his family. I stepped forward, met his gaze without flinching, and informed him that the property belonged to my family's trust, that his lease was legally terminated, and that he was currently trespassing on my estate. The color completely drained from his face as the legal reality finally hit him. He looked wildly around the room, realizing that his wealth, his control, his home, and his standing had vanished simultaneously. In a final, desperate burst of unfocused rage, he lunged toward me, but the 2 deputies moved instantly, pinning his arms behind his back, forcing him to the ground, and securing him in handcuffs before marching him down the front steps into a waiting patrol car. Megan and I stood together in the quiet foyer of the vacant house, looking at the mess left behind. The illusion of perfection that had dominated her life for years had been completely shattered, leaving behind only the work of rebuilding. I put my arm around her shoulders, pulled her close, and told her it was time to clear out the remains of the past and go home. In the months that followed, our lives settled into a new, meaningful rhythm. We sold the Greenwich property and purchased a light-filled historic home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, featuring a spacious garden in the rear and an attached studio space where Megan enrolled in a graduate program for art conservation. Using a portion of the trust's proceeds, we established the Evelyn and Richard Reed Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing immediate legal representation, housing assistance, and financial independence resources for women escaping domestic control. Looking back, the terrifying fall onto that cold kitchen floor felt like the end of my life. But in truth, it was the necessary catalyst for a rebirth. It was the precise moment a 69-year-old woman and her daughter reclaimed their autonomy and learned to stand firm. True dignity is never something granted by others. It is a boundary we define for ourselves, and real strength lies not in avoiding the fall, but in ensuring that when we rise, we change the rules of the world around us.